Welcome to Hidden Wounds. If there is a single lesson that life has engraved upon my soul, it is this: the deepest betrayals are never delivered by your enemies. They come from those who share your own blood, the very people you once lifted in your arms, and into whom you poured your entire being. For me, that betrayal struck 11 years ago, a moment so piercing and frigid that it split my life in two. It was a Saturday afternoon, early in the spring. The air carried the scent of jasmine from a vine I had planted myself outside my son's house many years before, back in a time when I still believed that love was a strong enough mortar to hold a family together. I had brought his favorite, a 20-year-old single malt Scotch, carrying it to his door with the naive hope that we could find our way back to each other. My heart felt heavy, yet it was open, vulnerable, yet prepared. When the door finally opened, it wasn't my son's face that I saw first. It was hers, my daughter-in-law, Jessica. Her smile was a tight, thin line, and her eyes were like chips of ice. She leaned against the doorframe with an air of ownership, as if the house was hers and hers alone. From behind her, I heard my son Leo's voice, calm, practiced, and unnervingly distant. "Father, we need to talk." He came into view, and the air left my lungs. He seemed transformed, harder, more severe. He was not the boy I had raised, not the man I had believed him to be. His words were measured and deliberate, as though he had rehearsed them in front of a mirror until their edges were sharp enough to cut me to the bone. "I would rather lose my father than my wife. Please, don't contact us anymore." The ground seemed to give way beneath me. I gripped the bottle of Scotch tighter, not because I was losing my balance, but to prevent myself from shattering completely. I searched his eyes, desperate for any flicker of the boy who once clung to my hand during summer thunderstorms, the boy who used to whisper his dreams to me in the dark. But there was nothing there, only a void, a dismissal. And beside him stood Jessica, her lips curved into a smirk of triumph, as if she had just extinguished the last ember of my existence. I turned and walked away without uttering a single word. My dress shoes clicked on the pavement, each step a heavier weight than the one before. The bottle in my hand felt cool, its smoothness, a cruel mockery of the profound chill that had taken hold deep inside my chest. By the time I was back in my car, my vision was blurred by unshed tears. I didn't even open the Scotch. When I returned home, I poured it down the drain, as if by discarding the gift, I could somehow wash away the sting of the humiliation. For weeks, I existed in a dense fog. The phone remained silent. Holidays arrived and departed without a trace. Birthdays passed like silent specters. I would sit alone in my dining room, staring at the empty chair opposite me, trying to comprehend how a father's love could be rendered so utterly disposable. The silence from my son wasn't just an absence. It was a deliberate punishment, a sentence handed down for transgressions I had never committed, yet for which I was forced to pay the ultimate price. I stopped setting a second place at the table for him. I stopped glancing at my phone, hoping for a message. I learned to push the yearning down so deep within me that it hardened into stone. That stone became the cornerstone of a promise I made to myself in the echoing silence of my empty house. If they ever return, I will not forgive, I will not forget, and I will ensure they never win. The years crept forward, but grief is a peculiar artist. It chips away at your weaknesses, hones your resolve, and what remains is something stronger, something that cannot be broken. I channeled my anguish into my work. I was up before the sunrise, poring over blueprints until my vision blurred, traveling so relentlessly that airport terminals started to feel more like home than my own bed. Gradually, the fog began to dissipate. Slowly, I realized I could not only survive without them, but I could flourish. But I want to be perfectly clear. Flourishing does not erase betrayal. It becomes the fuel for retribution. Because deep inside me, beneath the tailored suits and the polished cufflinks, a fire continued to burn. And that fire whispered to me every single night, one day, they will regret this. One day, they will come crawling back. And when they do, they will not find a father. They will find a final judgment. So now when people comment on how calm and composed I appear, I tell them the truth. Time doesn't heal all wounds. It simply teaches you how to forge them into weapons. And mine was sharpened to a razor's edge. This is not a story about reconciliation. This is not about forgiveness. This is a story about revenge served ice cold and a day of reckoning that no one ever saw coming. I couldn't have known it then, on that spring afternoon, standing on my son's front porch with a bottle of fine scotch growing heavy in my hands. But those words, "I would rather lose my father than my wife," were not the final chapter of my story. They were the very beginning. The beginning of my transformation, the beginning of my empire, and the beginning of a vengeance that would take 11 years to mature, 11 years to perfect, because when they cast me out, they set me free. They liberated me to become the man I was always destined to be. And I made a solemn vow to myself. If the day ever came when they tried to take anything from me again, I would be ready. And I would make certain they left with nothing but tears. When the fog of betrayal finally lifted, what was left behind was not weakness. It was a hunger. A hunger to prove, not to my son, not to that venomous woman he married, but to myself that I was more than the cast-off father they saw me as. I was 50 years old when I returned to my office that Monday, after he had told me to vanish from his life. My architectural firm was modest back then, a boutique operation with a small roster of dedicated clients. Most of my contemporaries were planning their retirements, simplifying their lives, or doting on their grandchildren. But not me. I had no grandchildren to embrace. I had no family to ease me into my later years. All that remained was my work and the inferno raging in my chest. I remember standing in the center of my office, looking at the architectural drawings spread across my desk and the material samples pinned to the board. I whispered to the empty room, "You are all I have left. You will become my kingdom." It was an arduous path. The corporate world is not kind to older men, especially those perceived as being past their prime. Younger men in slick suits would smirk when I walked into boardrooms. Potential clients would look surprised when I introduced myself as the principal architect, not just a senior consultant. I was told again and again that my best days were behind me. The word old was used like a brand, but the betrayal had rendered me immune to such petty insults. Every condescending glance, every dismissive comment, every patronizing smile was merely more fuel for the fire. I worked late into the night, scrutinized every contract, researched emerging design trends, and poured my soul into every proposal. If they wanted to underestimate me, I would make damn sure their miscalculation came at a steep price. My designs were more than just buildings. They were experiences. I turned sterile office blocks into monuments of commerce and cold houses into warm, inviting sanctuaries. The word of my work spread, slowly at first, but then it ignited like a wildfire. Within 5 years, my company was no longer a small boutique firm. It was a name that commanded respect, mentioned in the same breath as corporations 3 times its size. But the success came at a great personal cost. While others enjoyed family dinners, I ate takeout meals alone at my drafting table. While others were surrounded by the laughter of grandchildren, my only companion was the low hum of my computer. And still, I wouldn't have traded it. because whenever exhaustion tried to claim me, I would remember the look in my son's eyes and the cruel satisfaction in my daughter-in-law's smirk, and I would whisper back, "Not yet, you haven't won." There were nights when the loneliness was a crushing weight. Nights I'd sit on the edge of my bed, still in my suit from a long day, and just stare at the shadows playing on the wall. My phone would light up with messages from clients, bankers, and contractors. But never from him. Never from the boy who once depended on me for everything. In those moments, tears might fall, but they were followed by a renewed sense of resolve. Because if they thought they had erased me, I would carve my name into the very bedrock of the world, so deep it could never be weathered away. By my 60th birthday, my firm's revenues had tripled. I was flying first class, touring penthouses with skyline views, and shaking hands with CEOs who, years earlier, wouldn't have bothered to return my calls. I had built an empire from the ashes of my old life. I carried myself with the quiet confidence of a king who required no one's validation. My silver-streaked hair, once seen as a sign of decline, became my crown. My cufflinks, once simple, became my armor. When I entered a room, people took notice. When I spoke, they listened. I recall one pivotal meeting in New York City, a deal that was set to launch my firm into the international market. The man sitting across from me, a billionaire real estate mogul, leaned back and said, "You know, most men your age would be happy to be on the golf course." I leaned forward, met his gaze without flinching, and replied, "I am not most men, and if you believe my age is a liability, you've already lost this negotiation." By the end of the hour, he signed the contract, not out of pity, but out of respect. It was a respect I had earned, forged in the fires of betrayal and carved out with sheer determination. Then, just 2 years later, the call I had been working towards finally came, an acquisition offer of $12 million. My company, my creation, had grown so powerful that others wanted to claim it as their own. I could have refused. I could have continued to build. But a quiet voice inside me said that this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not the conclusion of my story, but the crucial turning point. The moment I could convert all those years of sacrifice into something untouchable. I signed the deal with a steady hand. The ink was barely dry when I walked out of that boardroom, my head held high, my suit immaculate. I had transformed from a discarded father into a self-made millionaire, and I had achieved it all without their love, without their approval, and without their presence. That evening, I poured myself a glass of deep red wine and sat on my balcony, gazing out at the sprawling city lights. For the first time in more than a decade, I allowed myself to take a deep breath, to smile not with bitterness, but with a profound sense of pride. But even in that moment of triumph, as the wine warmed me and the city hummed below, I knew that betrayal doesn't simply disappear, it lies in wait. And one day the very people who had cast me aside would inevitably return, not with apologies, not with love, but with greed. And when that day came, I would be prepared, because this empire I had constructed wasn't just for me. It was my weapon, my fortress, and my trap. And the day they tried to lay claim to it, I would ensure they left with nothing but their own tears. When the ink dried on that $12 million contract, I didn't feel a sense of relief. I felt destiny shifting beneath my feet. For 11 years, I had been spiritually homeless, adrift between hotels, business trips, and an office that served as my only sanctuary. I owned properties, certainly, but I didn't have a true home, not a fortress befitting the man I had forged myself into. So, the very first thing I did after selling my company was to find one. Florida beckoned to me. Not the Florida of bustling beaches and raucous tourists, but the quiet, majestic coastline where the Atlantic stretches out like a vast, jeweled mirror under the sun. I craved space. I craved silence. I wanted walls that would echo my own name, not the ghosts of theirs. When my real estate agent drove me to the estate that would become my own, I knew it was the one before I even stepped out of the car. The gates themselves were a towering work of art, wrought iron twisted into elaborate patterns that spoke of both strength and elegance. Beyond them, the mansion stood like a monarch, draped in white marble, its columns reaching proudly towards the sky and its vast glass windows glittering like vigilant eyes. I walked through the grand entrance into a foyer, with ceilings so high they seemed to absorb all sound. My footsteps echoed against marble floors streaked with veins of gold. A magnificent, sweeping staircase curved upwards, an invitation to a new chapter of my life. I ran my fingers along the cool, smooth railing and thought to myself, this is not a house. This is a statement. I explored it room by room. The library, with its dark oak shelves, yearned for books on strategy and perseverance. The ballroom, polished to a mirror shine, awaited nights of influence disguised as celebration. The kitchen was vast enough to cater for an army, though I planned to dine alone more often than not. And then there was the view that solidified my decision. Standing on the balcony of the master's suite, I looked out over the endless expanse of the Atlantic. The horizon stretched on forever, a powerful reminder that I too had no limits. I bought it that same day. $12 million had made me wealthy, but this mansion made me untouchable. It was all mine, every stone, every tile. Every magnificent archway seemed to whisper that I had risen from the ashes of abandonment and built myself into something truly formidable. The first night I slept there, I lay in a king-sized bed, swathed in silk, the ocean breeze drifting through the open windows, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. I didn't toss and turn. For the first time in over a decade, I slept asleep untroubled by longing. I awoke with the morning sun on my skin and thought, this is my sanctuary, my throne, my fortress. I spent the following weeks making it my own, not for the approval of others but for myself. Every piece of furniture was selected to be a reflection of my power. Italian crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings like captured constellations. Rich Persian rugs were laid across the marble floors. The hallways were lined with paintings from artists the world had overlooked, each one chosen not for its fame, but for its personal resonance. At night, I would walk barefoot through the silent halls, a signet ring on my finger, my reflection gliding across the polished surfaces, and I would whisper to myself, this house is not empty, it is full of me. But I built more than just beauty, I built strength. The gates were equipped with a state-of-the-art security system. Cameras monitored every angle of the property. The legal ownership was locked down in an ironclad trust that no greedy hands could ever pry open. This mansion was more than my home. It was my weapon. A fortress of stone and law, designed not only to protect me but to decimate anyone who dared to think they could claim it. The neighbors gossiped, naturally. They saw the solitary man with the silver-streaked hair, the regal posture of someone who had weathered wars of the heart and emerged victorious. They would whisper over their fences, "Who is he? Where did he come from? How can he live all alone in a palace like that?" I offered no answers. Mystery served me well. Silence was a form of power, and besides, what could they possibly understand? They had not been betrayed by their own flesh and blood. They had not built an empire out of the rubble of grief. They had not learned to turn loneliness into a crown. My evenings developed into a ritual. I would pour a glass of wine, always red and full-bodied, and walk the grounds as the sun bled into the ocean. The pool shimmered like liquid sapphire. The gardens I had designed myself bloomed with roses, and the air was filled with a sense of reverent tranquility. I would stand on the balcony, the evening air cool against my skin, and say aloud to the waves, "You took nothing from me. You only cleared my path." And yet, in the profound quiet, I could feel it, the inevitability. Wealth attracts vultures. Success attracts parasites. And betrayal, well, betrayal has a habit of circling back when it catches the scent of opportunity. I didn't know when they would appear or how, but I was certain. The son who had told me to disappear from his life, the woman who had smiled as she erased me. They would eventually hear about my mansion, my fortune, my ascent, and they would come knocking. That certainty didn't frighten me. It thrilled me, because unlike 11 years ago, I was no longer vulnerable. I was not a father standing on a doorstep with a peace offering, begging for a crumb of affection. I was a king in his castle, and if they dared to return, I would not simply turn them away. I would utterly destroy them. So, I had the floors polished, the curtains hung, and I poured another glass of wine. My sanctuary was prepared. My fortress was secure. My trap was set. All I needed now was for them to walk into it. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The sun had just begun its ascent over the Atlantic, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink, when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel outside my gates. I was seated at my breakfast table, a silk robe tied neatly around my waist, my signet ring gleaming as always when the security monitor flickered on. And there they were, my son, my daughter-in-law, their 2 children, and behind them, a mountain of luggage, piled high like an army preparing for a long siege. My heart rate didn't increase. My hands did not tremble. On the contrary, a chilling calm washed over me. It was the calm of a patient hunter who has waited years for his prey to wander directly into his sights. The intercom buzzed, and a voice, sharp and dripping with entitlement, filled my dining room. "Father, open the gate. We're here to move in." I pressed the button to acknowledge the call, but said nothing. I let them wait. Let them feel the imposing weight of those iron gates that stood between them and what they wanted. Through the camera feed, I studied their faces. My son Leo had the expression of a man who genuinely believed he was doing me a favor by showing up. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, had a triumphant glint in her eyes, as if she were already imagining herself draped across my custom-made furniture, claiming my mansion as her new throne. The children, the only innocents in this drama, looked around with wide-eyed curiosity, their small hands clutching toys they would no doubt soon be scattering across my pristine floors. I rose from my chair slowly, each movement deliberate, and walked through the vastness of the mansion until I reached the massive front door. When I pulled it open, a cool sea breeze swept in, carrying with it the scent of long-awaited justice. Beyond the gates, they finally saw me, standing tall, my silver hair catching the morning light. Their expressions shifted from relief and anticipation to sheer, unadulterated arrogance. The gate finally slid open, and they began rolling their suitcases up the long driveway as if they had already received a warm welcome. My son barely glanced in my direction before stating, "Father, we need more room. The kids are getting older, and this mansion is much too big for one person. It just makes sense for us to move in." His wife added, "Yes, Arthur. It's really impractical for a man your age to manage all this. We'll put it to good use. You'll see." For a long moment, I remained silent. I simply observed them. My son, the man who had once declared he'd rather lose his father than his wife, and the woman who had manipulated him into believing it. My silence seemed to unnerve them. I saw it in the flicker of his eyes and the tightening of her smile. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low and even, each word measured like the tolling of a bell. "There is no space for you here." Their laughter was sharp and nervous. My son attempted to dismiss my words. "Come on, Father, don't be so dramatic. We're family. Of course, there's space for us here." I let the silence stretch again, my gaze unwavering. Then, I stepped forward, closing the distance until I could see the fine lines of stress around their eyes, the smug tilt of her chin, and the shallow way he breathed when confronted. I leaned in just enough for my words to land with maximum impact. "Family? 11 years ago you told me I was nothing to you. You told me to never contact you again, and I respected that wish. So, you tell me what has changed. Because it wasn't love that brought you here. It wasn't forgiveness. It was greed." Her smile vanished. My son's jaw clenched. He started to stammer out excuses, words about the children needing space, about practicality, about financial hardships. I let him talk, letting each lie dig their grave a little deeper. When he was finished, I nodded slowly, as if I were considering his pathetic plea. Then I said, "I see. You didn't come back for me. You came back for this mansion, for the fortune, for the empire I built." The children began to shuffle their feet, sensing the rising tension. My daughter-in-law placed a hand on my son's arm and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Just be firm. He'll give in." As if I were some frail old man just waiting to be steamrolled. But they couldn't see the man who had survived their betrayal. The man who had spun grief into gold. The man who had constructed a fortress not just of marble and glass, but of impenetrable legal foresight. They did not see the hunter who had been anticipating this very moment. I straightened my posture, my suit feeling like armor, and delivered the words that cut through the morning air. "You have no space here. Not in this house. Not in my life. Not anywhere." Tears welled in my son's eyes, not of remorse, but of pure frustration. His wife's face contorted with fury. She hissed, "You can't do this to us. We're your family. We deserve this house." Deserve. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. My lips curled into the faintest of smiles, one sharp enough to draw blood. "You deserve nothing from me. Nothing except for what you gave me. And do you remember what you gave me 11 years ago?" Silence. Betrayal. I paused. "So now I am simply returning the gift." Her face went pale. My son stammered, "Father, please." But I raised a hand, cutting him off. My voice was like ice. "You told me not to contact you. I am merely honoring your request." They stood there, frozen, the mansion looming behind me like a monument to their miscalculation. For the first time, they were beginning to understand that they were not in control. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes, the fear of a predator who has gravely underestimated her prey. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I simply stepped back into the marble foyer and let the heavy door swing shut slowly, deliberately, until their faces were obscured by the dark wood. The sound of the deadbolt locking into place was more satisfying than any symphony I had ever heard. Through the security cameras, I watched them argue on my driveway. He gestured wildly, she was shouting, and the children clung to their toys, looking lost. They loaded their luggage back into the car with angry, jerky movements. The engine roared to life, but before they drove away, she cast one final look at the mansion, her eyes filled with a promise of return. Good. Let her come back. Let them both come back. Because this was only the first act. I hadn't built this mansion simply to live in it. I had built it to ensnare them. And the next time they returned, and I knew they would, I would let them in. Not to share my life, but to completely and utterly ruin theirs. Because true revenge is not loud. It is quiet, patient, and meticulous. And my trap was just beginning to close. They returned 3 days later, just as I knew they would. Greed does not accept defeat. It merely regroups. The first time they came, they were met with the unyielding wall of my rejection. The second time, I decided to give them precisely what they thought they wanted. Because sometimes, the most effective way to destroy an enemy isn't to push them away. It is to draw them in closer and allow them to trap themselves. The knock on the great oak door echoed through the marble halls of my mansion like the beat of a war drum. I waited, sipping my tea in the drawing room, dressed in a tailored suit, my signet ring gleaming. When I opened the door, their expressions revealed everything. Desperation disguised as confidence, entitlement cloaked in a thin veneer of civility. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, smiled, a smile clearly rehearsed in a mirror. "Arthur, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. We just want to be close to you. The children deserve to know their grandfather." Her words were dripping with a counterfeit sweetness, but her eyes gave her away. They darted around the foyer, assessing the chandeliers, calculating the value of every square inch. My son, Leo, more subdued this time, added, "Father, please, let's not fight. We only want to be here with you." I let my gaze rest on his face. The boy I had raised was still buried somewhere deep inside the man standing before me, but he was unreachable now, shackled to the woman by his side. Still, I softened my expression into a small, accommodating smile. "Family," I said smoothly, "is family. Of course, you can stay. Come in." The wave of relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. They stepped inside, dragging their suitcases across my polished marble floors, their children running ahead into the grand foyer with cries of delight. My daughter-in-law's heels clicked with a rhythm of conquest as she surveyed what she believed was her new territory. She had absolutely no idea that she had just willingly walked into a cage. Before they had moved a single suitcase past the threshold, I gestured to a set of documents I had placed on the console table by the door. They were crisp, official, and neatly arranged. "Before we all get settled," I said, my tone casual, "I just need you both to sign these routine liability forms. It's for the insurance, security access, guest permissions, just standard procedure for anyone staying on the property." They didn't hesitate. Greedy people rarely bother with the fine print when they believe they are being handed a treasure. They signed their names with barely a glance, eager to start claiming what they thought was now theirs. My son signed quickly, perhaps with a hint of guilt, but his wife signed with a dramatic flourish, almost smugly, as if the ink itself were a declaration of her victory. I smiled and carefully put the documents away. Little did they know, they had just signed legally binding contracts that would transform their greed into inescapable chains. For the next few days, I played the part of the gracious host. I let them settle into the east wing of the mansion, where the ceilings were vaulted and the windows opened directly onto the ocean. They filled the rooms with their belongings, scattered toys across priceless antique rugs, and hung their clothes in wardrobes that had stood empty for years. At night, I would walk past their closed doors and hear their laughter, smug, triumphant laughter, like vultures feasting on what they mistakenly believed was a carcass. My daughter-in-law began to assert her control almost immediately, just as I had anticipated. She strode into the kitchen one morning and announced, "This space is terribly outdated. We'll need to do a complete renovation. I have a contractor in mind." I sipped my coffee and simply nodded. "Of course, dear. Make a list of everything you think should be changed." She did, scribbling furiously. completely unaware that every single demand, every presumptuous suggestion was being meticulously documented. My son started inviting his friends over, showing off the mansion as if it were already his inheritance. He stood in the ballroom one evening, a glass of my best scotch in his hand, boasting, "It won't be long before we're hosting some real parties here. This house was meant for us." His friends cheered, their glasses clinking under chandeliers that glistened like captured starlight. I watched it all from the shadows of the balcony, unseen, my signet ring cold against my finger. Every word they spoke, every careless indulgence, was recorded. The mansion was no longer just a home. It was a stage, and they were giving the performance of their lives, oblivious to the fact that their audience was gathering evidence against them. Within a week, the emergency credit cards I had accidentally left in a kitchen drawer had disappeared. I had expected it. Soon, the notifications began to flood in. Charges for designer clothes, expensive jewelry, the latest electronics, all spent with reckless abandon. My daughter-in-law even bragged on a phone call one night, unaware that the mansion's security system was capturing every single word. "This house is practically ours. The old man won't last much longer. When he's gone, everything will belong to us." Her words didn't sting me. They delighted me, because she was walking precisely where I wanted her to go, straight into the center of my web. To them, I remained the picture of serenity, gracious, accommodating, even generous. I prepared them dinners, invited them to sit with me in the gardens, and told stories to their children by the fireside. My daughter-in-law would sometimes look at me with a hint of suspicion, as if she couldn't quite understand my compliance. But greed is a powerful blinder. The more I smiled, the more she was convinced that she was winning. And yet, when I retreated to my private suite each night, locking the door firmly behind me, I would look at my reflection in the mirror and smile not with kindness, but with cold, hard calculation. Because while they thought they were building a new home for themselves, I was building a legal case against them. Every credit card receipt, every overheard insult, every misuse of my property was another brick in the wall I was constructing to crush them. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear between them. Greed doesn't unite people, it corrodes them. I began to overhear their whispered arguments late at night. She craved total control. He craved my approval. She talked about redecorating entire wings of the house. He talked about selling off assets to cover his debts. Their voices would grow sharp and bitter until their children's crying would finally silence them. And through it all, I said nothing. I let the mansion itself work its poison. Because sometimes revenge is not about the strike, but about the patient, deliberate wait. On the surface, I was the image of warmth. I welcomed them. I provided for them. I allowed them to believe they were conquering me. But on the inside, I was made of steel. Every smile was a finely honed blade. Every nod of agreement was a spring-loaded trap. And with every passing day they sank deeper into the quicksand of their own arrogance. The mansion they saw as their ultimate prize was, in truth, becoming their prison. And I was the warden, holding the keys, waiting for the perfect moment to lock the doors for good. Because revenge is not about striking first. It is about waiting until your enemies are convinced they have already won, and then pulling the very ground out from under their feet. And my son, my betrayer, and his wife had just stepped onto the ground I fully intended to collapse. It didn't take long for the cracks in their performance to widen into canyons. My son and his wife believed they were crafting a life of opulence within my walls. They were oblivious to the fact that I was turning those very walls into mirrors, designed to reflect their every flaw, every greedy impulse, right back at them. By the time they realized what I was doing, it would be far too late. Every corner of the mansion was under surveillance. I had invested in a state-of-the-art system. Cameras subtly hidden in chandeliers, microphones concealed within wall sconces, motion sensors in the hallways. Nothing escaped my notice. Every whispered insult, every heated argument, every boastful claim of "when this house is ours" was captured with pristine clarity. At night, while they slept soundly in the East Wing, I would sit in my private study, my silver hair falling over a silk dressing gown, and replay the day's footage. I cataloged everything with meticulous precision. Timestamps, transcripts, video clips. I created and labeled digital folders. Fraud, neglect, defamation, financial theft. Each file was another nail in the coffin I was carefully preparing for them. The documents they had so carelessly signed at the door became the bedrock of my fortress. My legal team had crafted them with surgical precision, embedding clauses about property damage, conditions of use, and strict prohibitions against any form of financial exploitation. Every time they swiped one of my credit cards, every time they hosted an unauthorized party, every time they spoke of ownership, they weren't just indulging themselves. They were actively breaching the terms of a legally binding agreement. They thought they were claiming my mansion. In reality, they were writing their own detailed confession. With each passing day, their arrogance swelled. My daughter-in-law started hosting luncheons in my formal dining room, inviting her friends to come and marvel at her new, elevated life. She would parade them through the hallways, flinging open doors to rooms she had no right to enter, bragging about her grand plans for redecoration, how the art was too old-fashioned, and how the furniture needed a modern touch. Her sycophantic friends, desperate for proximity to wealth, would nod and gush with approval, but I saw the glances they cast in my direction, a mixture of pity and awe. They saw me sitting at the head of the table, a signet ring on my finger, a fixed smile on my face, sipping my tea in complete silence. They mistook my silence for weakness. They didn't understand that my silence was my power. Every word that she uttered was another turn of the rope tightening around her own neck, and I was holding the other end. My son, meanwhile, sank deeper into his own indulgences. He invited his business colleagues over, men who had once looked down on him, and showed them the ballroom as if it were his personal property. They drank my finest liquor. They laughed, and they toasted to his bright future. I watched from the shadows of the upper balcony, my signet ring feeling cool against my skin, and I thought, "You don't even realize the ground beneath your feet is quicksand." One evening, I heard her voice echoing from the kitchen, sharp and grating. She was on the phone, pacing back and forth, her heels clicking angrily on the marble. "The house is practically ours," she hissed into the phone. "The old man can't last much longer, and when he's gone, everything will be under our control." The microphone hidden above the kitchen island captured every single syllable. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't correct her. I simply allowed the mansion to absorb her words, storing them away for the day I would unleash them back upon her. Betrayal spoken aloud is like venom in a bottle. It only grows more potent with time. The only innocents in this whole affair were the children. They played in the gardens, they laughed in the swimming pool, and occasionally they would knock on my study door and ask me to tell them a story. I showed them kindness, not just for their sake, but because I knew that one day they would remember the stark contrast. The grandfather who offered them warmth, and the parents who dragged them into a world of greed. But even the children unwittingly revealed the truth. One evening, I overheard the eldest whisper to the younger, "Mommy says this whole house is going to be ours soon." Their voices were innocent, but their words were proof. Proof that their mother's poison ran so deep, she was already corrupting the next generation with her lies. Greed may bind people together for a time, but it is a weak adhesive. Within weeks, I could see the cracks widening between them. At night, their voices would rise from the east wing, sharp as daggers cutting through the silence. He accused her of spending too much, of drawing unwanted attention with her arrogance. She accused him of being too timid, too unwilling to seize the power she felt was rightfully theirs. "If you had more of a backbone," I heard her scream one night, "we wouldn't be sitting here waiting for him to die. We'd already be running this house." His reply was muffled but fierce. "Do you really think he's just going to hand it all over to us? He's not as weak as you think." I allowed myself a small smile when I heard that. On that one point at least, he was correct. But I also knew his words weren't born of loyalty. They were born of fear. The fear that even as he leached off of me, he could sense the quiet storm that I was gathering. They began to invite more and more people over: friends, acquaintances, business partners. The mansion, which I had maintained as a sanctuary of quiet dignity, became a stage for their vulgar vanity. I let them use it. I let them laugh and drink and boast. But every guest who came saw something that they, in their blindness, could not. They saw the man in the tailored suit, sitting silently, not protesting, not interfering, just watching. And people always take notice when a king sits in silence. They begin to wonder, who truly holds the crown? Whispers began to spread. Their own friends started speaking of them as opportunists, as greedy parasites feeding off the man who owned it all. And while they preened and postured, their reputations were quietly rotting away. Each night, after their guests had departed and the house fell silent, I would walk the halls alone, my bare feet on the cool marble, my signet ring on my finger, my reflection gliding across the polished glass surfaces. I would whisper to myself, "Patience, not yet." Then I would pour a glass of wine, return to my study, and review the day's recordings. Their laughter became evidence. Their arrogance became a liability, and I filed it all away, building a legal case so airtight that even their faintest breath could be turned against them. By the end of the second month, the trap had closed so tightly around them that they couldn't make a move without violating the terms of their stay. They had breached every single clause of the agreements they had signed. They had stolen, they had defamed, and they had overstepped at every possible turn. They believed they were weaving a grand future for themselves within my walls. In reality, they were entangling themselves in a net so vast and complex they couldn't even see its edges. And I was the spider at the center of the web, silent, patient, watching, and waiting for the precise moment to strike. Because revenge is not served in haste. It is crafted, it is nurtured, it is perfected. And when the time finally came, I would not simply deny them. I would strip them bare of their dignity, of their reputation, of their wealth, until all that remained was the bitter, enduring taste of their own betrayal. They thought they had taken over my mansion, but in truth, the mansion had taken over them, and I was ready to show them just how merciless its walls could be. The night of the gala was not chosen by chance. Revenge, much like architecture, demands perfect timing, a solid structure, and meticulous precision. For weeks, I had observed them preening and strutting around my home, wearing their masks of entitlement, completely blind to the fact that they were merely actors in a play for which I had written the script. And the gala? Oh, the gala was their opening night. I invited the most influential people in my circle: industry leaders, philanthropists, journalists, and politicians. These were people whose words could build or shatter reputations, whose whispers could topple legacies. The invitations themselves were works of art, gleaming with gold leaf and bearing my name, not theirs. Arthur, host. Arthur, patron. Arthur, the undisputed king of this mansion. When the evening arrived, the mansion was aglow, a cathedral of wealth and power. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their light fracturing across 1,000 crystal glasses and shimmering on the polished marble floors. Guests in elegant gowns and sharp tuxedos filled the grand ballroom, their laughter echoing up to the vaulted ceiling. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and servers moved like ghosts through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne. My son and his wife made their entrance as if they were the lords of the manor. She wore a dress that screamed ambition, its sequins glittering just a little too loudly under the soft lights. He walked with a forced confidence, his shoulders thrown back, his smile stretched a fraction too wide. They moved through the crowd, greeting guests with a distinct air of possession, as if the mansion were already theirs. For hours, they mingled, boasting quietly, planting the poisonous seeds of lies about inheriting everything, and I let them. I watched from across the room, my suit perfectly tailored, my signet ring gleaming at my finger. I stood tall, every inch the patriarch they had tried so desperately to erase. And when the perfect moment arrived, I raised my glass. A hush fell over the room. "Friends," I began, my voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "Tonight, I want to share with you not just this home, but a truth." The lights dimmed, and the musicians fell silent. A large screen descended from the ceiling, and every eye in the room turned towards it. I pressed a button on a small remote I held in my hand, and the first video clip began to play. It was my daughter-in-law's voice, dripping with venom. "The old man won't last much longer. This house will be ours." Gasps rippled through the ballroom, faces turned towards her, their eyes wide, their mouths agape in shock. Then, another clip. My son laughing drunkenly with his friends in this very ballroom. "This place was meant for us. Soon enough, it will be." More gasps. The murmurs rose, swelling like a wave crashing against a cliff. Then came the images. Receipts for extravagant purchases, all charged to my accounts. Footage of them hosting wild parties in my absence, bragging about how the mansion was theirs to command. Each piece of evidence was layered on top of the last, until the very air in the room grew thick with the stench of scandal. I turned back to my guests, my expression serene. For 11 years, I was told that I was nothing, that I was disposable. Tonight, I wanted you all to witness what happens when that kind of betrayal returns, hoping to collect a prize. I paused, letting my words sink in. But let me be perfectly clear. This house is not theirs, this life is not theirs, and no amount of greed will ever change that. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the whispers, sharp as shards of glass. Guests looked at my son and his wife with unconcealed disgust. Their so-called friends averted their eyes. The power couple they had tried so hard to portray dissolved right before them, exposed as nothing more than parasites, feeding on the man they had once abandoned. My daughter-in-law's face went white, a battle of fury and fear raging in her eyes. My son's lips trembled, his manufactured bravado completely shattered. They tried to speak, to offer some pathetic explanation, but no one was listening. The room had already passed its judgment, and the verdict was final. That night, their reputations collapsed in front of an audience too powerful to ever forget. And I, standing tall in my suit, felt the sweet, heavy weight of justice settle upon me like a crown. The gala had been the public spectacle. The morning after was the execution. At dawn, while they were still reeling from the humiliation, the knock came. My lawyers, dressed in impeccable suits, arrived at the East Wing, documents in hand, their expressions as unyielding as stone. My son opened the door, still wearing his wrinkled shirt from the night before, his eyes bloodshot, his hair a mess. Behind him, his wife paced like a caged tiger, her face a mask of rage and panic. The lead attorney spoke with calm, deliberate precision. "You are hereby notified that you have violated the terms of the agreements you signed upon entering this property." He handed them a folder thick with papers, each page a weapon. The clauses include prohibitions against theft, misuse of funds, defamation, and unauthorized occupancy. You are in breach of every one. They stammered, they protested, they shouted. "We didn't know, we didn't read it." The lawyer's reply was cold. Ignorance is not a defense. Page after page outlined their crimes. Receipts for the charges on the stolen credit cards, transcripts of their recorded conversations, video footage of their boasts, their insults, their blatant misuse of my home. The contracts they had so carelessly signed had transformed from mere paper into iron shackles. By their own hands, with their own signatures, they had condemned themselves. My daughter-in-law lunged for the documents, flipping through them with frantic, trembling hands. "This is ridiculous. He can't do this to us." The lawyer's gaze did not waver. "He can, and he has. You owe damages amounting to millions of dollars. Your assets will be seized to cover the costs." I appeared in the doorway behind them, my signet ring catching the light, my expression impassive. "You thought you were conquering me," I said softly. "You thought this mansion was your triumph, but it was always my fortress. And you signed away the key to your own downfall." Their faces crumbled. My son's hand shook so badly that he dropped the papers to the floor. My daughter-in-law's fury twisted into raw desperation. "We're family," she cried out. "You can't do this to us." I leaned forward, my voice as sharp and clear as glass. "You erased that word 11 years ago when you told me to disappear. You wanted me gone, and I honored that. Now I will honor it again, this time forever." The lawyers moved with swift efficiency. Court orders were filed. Bank accounts were frozen. Their cars were repossessed. Their suburban home, everything they had, was stripped away from them. Within days, the life they thought they had built collapsed into ruin. Their credit was destroyed, their reputations were in tatters, and their future was annihilated. They begged me for mercy, but I offered them none. Mercy is for those who make a mistake. This was punishment for those who betray. By the end of the week, they had nothing. Nothing but the haunting memory of a mansion they thought was theirs, and the cold, hard knowledge that the man they had dismissed as too old had orchestrated their complete and total ruin with elegance and patience. As they packed their last suitcase under the watchful eyes of lawyers and court officers, I stood in the doorway, my voice calm and final. "You once told me never to contact you again. Today, I honor that wish one last time. When you leave this property, you leave my life forever." The door shut behind them. Their cries and protests faded into silence. And I, Arthur, smiled, not with joy, but with the profound satisfaction of triumph. Revenge had been perfected. The web I had so carefully woven had left them bound, broken, and utterly bare before the world. Bankruptcy is not a single swift blow. It is a slow, grinding death of one's dignity. After the lawyers executed the court orders, my son and his wife became prisoners of their own profound shame. Their friends, once so eager to bask in the reflected glow of my mansion, no longer answered their calls. Social invitations vanished. Business associates kept their distance. Their names, once spoken with a shallow admiration, became a curse, whispered with a mixture of pity and disgust. I watched from a distance as sheriff's deputies arrived at their suburban home, a house built on the arrogant foundation of borrowed money and false pride. The children clutched their stuffed animals as their furniture was hauled out and loaded into trucks. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, observing the collapse of a family like a piece of cruel theater. My daughter-in-law shouted at the officers, her voice shrill with desperation. "This is a mistake. We're the victims here." But the world had already seen the truth on the night of the gala. Her pathetic protests fell on deaf ears. They were forced to move into a cramped apartment in a neighborhood far below the lavish lifestyle they had so proudly flaunted. The marble floors they once boasted about were replaced with stained, worn carpeting. The grand chandeliers gave way to single, flickering light bulbs. The lush garden where their children once played was now a cracked parking lot, littered with weeds and oil stains. Their new reality was not just poverty. It was a constant public humiliation. My son began to avoid his own reflection. His shoulders became permanently hunched, as if the immense weight of his failure were physically pressing down on him. He had gambled away his father's love for a woman's approval, and in the end, both had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing. His wife, once draped in designer gowns, now wore her bitterness like a second skin. She started fights with neighbors. She yelled at store clerks, and she raged at the perceived injustice of it all. But her rage could not erase the evidence. Her arrogance could not nullify the contract she had signed. And her venom could not erase the memory of a ballroom full of powerful people watching her spectacular downfall. They tried to appeal to me, of course. Letters began to arrive at the mansion, filled with pleas for forgiveness, for a second chance, for mercy. I never opened them. Instead, I instructed my lawyer to deliver my one and only reply. "You told me never to contact you again. I am honoring your wish." The silence that followed was heavier and more damning than any words I could have spoken. Their children, the innocent casualties of their parents' greed, would grow up with a stark contrast etched into their memories. They would remember the mansion, the shimmering pool, the vast gardens, and the echoing halls. And they would remember the cramped apartment, the constant shouting, the bitterness, and the shame. One day, they would understand the full truth of why it all happened. And when they did, their resentment would not be directed at me. It would fall squarely on the parents who had traded everything for nothing. And that knowledge, that generational stain, was the most exquisite layer of my revenge. It meant their shame would not end with them. It would echo forward, a curse entirely of their own making. The mansion is quiet now, not with emptiness, but with a profound sense of peace. Its marble floors no longer echo with the click of intruders' heels. Its rooms are no longer polluted by the stench of greed. It breathes again, a sanctuary restored to its rightful dignity. And I, Arthur, sit at its heart not as a victim, not as a discarded father, but as the king of a kingdom that was forged in betrayal and sealed by vengeance. Every morning, I walk the grounds. My silver hair catches the first light of dawn, my signet ring a solid weight on my hand. I pause on the balcony, overlooking the Atlantic, a cup of coffee in hand, and I listen to the waves. Their rhythm is steady, eternal, and indifferent, much like me. Because revenge does not need to scream. It whispers, it lingers, it reshapes the very air you breathe. I did not reconcile. I did not forgive. I did not open my doors to them ever again. And that, more than anything, is the sharpest blade of all. They now live in a self-imposed exile, haunted by the whispers of who they used to be and what they could have had. When people mention their names, it is not with respect, but with scorn. And when they think of me, They do not imagine weakness. They imagine the night of the gala, the irrefutable contracts, the sound of the great door shutting behind them forever. They imagine the father they thought they had conquered, standing taller than they ever could. This, to me, is true victory. Not their destruction, not their absence, but their perpetual, unending regret. A life lived in the long shadow of a man they dismissed as too old, too fragile, too irrelevant. A man who outlasted their schemes and systematically dismantled their illusions. As the sun sets each evening, I sit by the ocean, the last light gleaming on my ring, and I whisper the words that have become my creed. Revenge doesn't require rage, it only requires patience. Patience. And the absolute certainty that when betrayal comes circling back, you will be ready to greet it. Not with open arms, but with a closed fist and a crown of silence. I am Arthur. I lost a son, but I gained an empire, and I made sure the world would never forget the price of underestimating me. This is my truth, a testament that from the deepest wounds can grow the strongest resolve. If my story resonated with you, if it stirred something inside of you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that it's possible to rise again. Subscribe to Hidden Wounds and press the like button, so that more stories like this can find their way to those who are learning to turn their own scars into armor. Your journey is your own, but you are not alone in the fight. Remember that.